The prince, too fragile to join, sat in the high pavilion, his watery skull throbbing with each cheer from the crowd. Yet as he watched, he noticed patterns invisible to others, the hesitation of a knight before he struck, the exhaustion hidden beneath a horse's gallop, the strategy within the chaos. When his father asked who would win the final joust, the boy whispered a name, and though the knight was the least favored, his victory was swift and shocking. The crowd gasped. The king turned to his son in astonishment. From that day forward, the boy's whispers were no longer dismissed as childish guesses, but listened to with wary respect. But power brings danger. His cousins, strong of arm and eager for the throne, grew jealous. One night, a boy only a year older than him cornered the fragile prince in the library, mocking his twisted walk and fragile frame. "You will never be king," the cousin hissed. "The throne needs a man of stone, not a boy of water." With a cruel laugh, he shoved the prince to the ground. Shrieked the prince to the ground. His limbs buckled, his skull struck the marble floor, and then came the sound, that dreadful sloshing within his head. But when the cousin leaned closer to gloat, something strange happened. The prince looked up, his eyes shining like still pools under moonlight, and he whispered words his cousin would never forget. "A stone may break, but water always finds a way." The cousin fled, pale as death, and though he never spoke of it, he avoided the fragile boy from then on. Over time, servants began to tell stories of the prince's strange connection to water. They swore he could predict storms by listening to the fountains, that he calmed rivers with a touch, that when he wept, his tears fell not like drops, but like tiny streams that soaked the ground. Priests grew nervous, calling him unnatural. Mothers brought their children to see him, believing he carried blessings. And all the while, he grew, not strong, not unbroken, but enduring. Like water in a vessel too small, he began to press against the walls of his fate. His father, once silent and grim, began to watch him with a new expression. Fear mixed with awe. The boy was no warrior, but he was something else, something dangerous, something unstoppable. By his 10th year, it was clear the fragile prince was no longer merely a curiosity or a jest. He was becoming a force. And though his bones were liquid, his mind was sharper than steel. The kingdom had yet to realize it, but within their frail air burned a tide waiting to rise. By the time the fragile prince reached his 13th year, the court had given him a name, the Hollow Heir. It was whispered in the corridors, muttered at feasts, and carved into the gossip of foreign ambassadors who returned home with tales of a boy whose skull sloshed like a wineskin. To the nobles, he was not a successor, but a symbol of weakness, a walking omen that the dynasty would shatter the moment his father's crown passed to him. Yet, while they mocked, he listened. He sat silently through their sneers, fragile fingers wrapped around his goblet, head tilted slightly as if eavesdropping on something no one else could hear. And indeed, he was listening, not to their cruel laughter, but to the currents within his skull. The water spoke to him in whispers, ancient and fractured voices that rose like ripples in a pond. They told him secrets of the court, reminded him of alliances forged centuries past, and guided him toward knowledge that no boy his age should have known. The more the court mocked him, the sharper his mind became. He began to anticipate their insults, parrying their words with wit so cutting that even grown men blushed in silence. When a duke sneered that a king should be forged of iron, not of water, the boy replied softly, "Iron rusts. Water remains." The hall laughed, but uneasily, because deep down they could not deny the truth. They tried to bait him, to humiliate him, to prove him a fool. Instead, they found themselves tangled in his words, exposed by his clever retorts, embarrassed by the brilliance shining from a body they considered broken. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to fear him. But the Hollow Heir was not content with words alone. Forbidden from training with the knights, lest his bones shatter under the weight of armor, he studied their drills from the balcony. Day after day, he watched the clashing of swords, the pounding of hooves, the gleam of lances under the sun. He memorized their movements, noting each flaw, each hesitation, each overreach. Then, in secret, he began to design strategies of his own. He spread maps across his chamber floor, placing stones, cups, and candles as armies, moving them as if he commanded legions. Servants would sometimes stumble upon him in the dead of night, whispering to himself, eyes glowing with strange light as water sloshed in his skull. They swore they heard him speaking with voices not his own, ancestors, perhaps, or the drowned. His father, the king, watched from afar with growing unease. Though the boy's body remained frail, his mind had become something formidable. When neighboring kingdoms sent envoys, the prince shocked them by speaking in their tongues, recalling the names of their long-dead kings, even quoting treaties signed generations ago. More than once, ambassadors returned home unsettled, whispering that the hollow air carried not merely knowledge but memory itself, as though the waters in his head held the entire history of the realm. Priests, meanwhile, argued bitterly in the temples. Was the boy cursed by the gods of the deep? Or was he their vessel, a chosen oracle wrapped in fragile flesh? Jealousy festered among his cousins and rivals. Stronger boys with straighter bones could not understand how the frail heir, who could barely lift a sword, was already outshining them. Several tried to shame him in public. At a feast, one cousin shoved him before the court, sneering that a true king should stand without help. The boy stumbled, water sloshing audibly in his head, and laughter erupted through the hall. But instead of tears, he straightened, his pale face calm. "I, king, does not need to stand," he said, voice carrying through the chamber, "for kingdoms kneel." The laughter died. That night, the cousin was found beaten by unknown hands, his lips too swollen to speak the insult again. None dared question who had orchestrated it, but eyes turned toward the hollow air, who sat quietly with his cup, listening to whispers only he could hear. And the whispers grew louder with each passing year. Sometimes in the stillness of night he would wake drenched in sweat, rivers roaring inside his skull, voices shouting fragments of forgotten battles. He began to dream of oceans swallowing cities, of waves crowned with lightning, of drowning kings gasping their final prayers. When he woke, he wrote down every detail, turning nightmares into strategies, prophecies, and warnings. His journals, locked away, filled faster than his servants could replace them. Already, he was preparing for a throne that most believed would break him the moment he touched it. At 15, he proved them all wrong. When raiders struck a coastal village, the council panicked, arguing whether to send troops or fortify the capital. The king, weary and uncertain, turned to his son. The hollow air, too weak to ride into battle, studied the reports, traced the rivers with his trembling finger, and whispered a command: flood the marshes, trap the raiders where the land would swallow them whole. His plan was followed reluctantly, mocked at first, but when the raiders drowned in the muck, their bodies swallowed by the tide, the court fell silent. A frail boy had turned the land itself into a weapon. From that day forward, his enemies mocked less. They still called him the hollow air, but now the words carried unease. For they had begun to realize that a hollow vessel could hold the weight of oceans, and oceans, when unleashed, could drown empires. When the hollow air reached his 17th year, the weight of expectation pressed upon him like a crown of lead. By then the king had grown old and weary, his hair silvered, his voice cracked, his hands shaking upon the scepter. It was clear to all that the throne would soon pass to the boy whose very body seemed to define nature. The nobles who once mocked now spoke in hushed tones. Some plotted how to control him once he wore the crown. Others whispered that the moment the king died, they would depose the frail heir and place a sturdier cousin upon the throne. Yet none could deny the tide of inevitability. For though his body still bent like reeds in the wind, the hollow heir's mind had become the sharpest blade in the kingdom. His victories in council, his unbroken foresight in matters of war and trade, had made him indispensable. A boy mocked as hollow had filled himself with the power of an ocean. But within his skull the waters had grown restless. The whispers that once came like ripples now surged like crashing waves. At first he thought them dreams, memories of long-dead kings and generals, fragments of battles long past. Yet as he listened, he realized these were not simply echoes of history. They were voices, many and overlapping, whispering in a chorus of currents. Some pleaded, some commanded, some wept with sorrow. They spoke of mistakes made centuries ago, of blood spilled and bargains struck with gods of the deep. He began to see patterns in them, prophecies of storms to come, warnings of betrayal within the palace itself. And while others slept, he spent long nights pacing by candlelight, head bowed under the pressure of waters only he could hear. It was during one such night that he realized the truth. The water inside his skull was not merely strange flesh, not a defect of his birth. It was a vessel, a prison, perhaps even a gift. It carried memory not only of his bloodline, but of something far older, the memory of the sea itself. He began to dream not just of past kings, but of waves swallowing cities, of ships crushed beneath storms, of empires drowned by floods. In these visions, he was always there, standing at the center, his body breaking, his bones bending, his skull bursting with tides. When he awoke, drenched in sweat, he wrote the same words again and again. The sea will claim its son. His father noticed the changes. The old king watched his son with wary eyes, saw the sleepless nights, the trembling hands, the distant gaze, as though he were always listening to something beyond mortal hearing. At last, the king confronted him in the chamber of state. "You are my heir," he said, his voice hoarse with age. "But you frighten me, boy. There is something in you that does not belong to men." The hollow heir met his father's gaze with calm eyes. Perhaps," he whispered, "that is why I was born to rule them." The old king shuddered, for in that moment he saw not his frail son, but a storm waiting to break. The council grew more divided. Some urged the king to name another heir, a cousin of strong limbs and steady bones. Others warned that such a move would spark rebellion, for the hollow heir had already won the hearts of the common people. Strange as he was, the peasants saw him as their own, a prince who suffered, a prince who endured mockery and pain yet still spoke for them. His clever strategies had saved villages from raiders and floods, his foresight had prevented famines, and his words carried the weight of truth. Better a king of water, they said, than a king of rust, but the hollow heir himself felt no triumph. The louder the voices grew, the more he sensed that his throne was only a small part of a much larger design. At times, he felt the water inside him surge so violently he could scarcely stand. He feared that one day it would burst through his skull, drowning him before the eyes of all. Yet in those moments, another voice always rose above the rest, deep, resonant, and ancient. "You are not cursed," it told him. "You are chosen. The tide does not ask the land if it may rise. It simply rises, simply rises." And so he prepared himself, not just to be king, but to be something more. His body might bend, his bones might shiver, but his destiny was no longer bound by flesh. He was water, and water could not be broken. The storm of destiny came sooner than anyone expected. In the spring of his 19th year, when the snows melted and rivers ran swollen with meltwater, an army from the north swept down into the kingdom. They came like wolves in the night, riders clad in furs, axes gleaming, banners snapping in the icy wind. Village after village burned, fields were stripped bare, and the cries of refugees reached the palace gates. The king, frail and coughing blood, could no longer lead his armies. The burden of command fell upon the hollow heir, whose own body seemed ready to shatter beneath the weight of responsibility. The nobles scoffed at the thought. "He cannot even hold a sword," they sneered. "How will he defend a realm?" But the boy who had grown up mocked as hollow simply closed his eyes, tilted his head, and listened. Within his skull the waters roared, voices overlapping like waves crashing against cliffs. They told him where the invaders would strike, where the rivers would swell, where the land itself could become his ally. And when he opened his eyes, he gave his first command as de facto ruler of the realm. It was not to rally knights or sharpen swords. It was to dam the rivers. The court balked at the order. Generals raged that this was madness. Priests cried it was blasphemy to tamper with the courses of rivers blessed by the gods. But the hollow heir did not waver. "A steel cannot win this war," he said softly. "But water can." Against their protest, workers were sent to the marshlands. Trees were felled, earth was moved, dikes were raised under the cover of night. While the invaders marched deeper into the heart of the realm, burning towns as they went, the hollow heir wove an invisible trap. The decisive moment came at Blackreed Valley. The invaders, laden with plunder, marched into the wide basin where reeds grew thick and the marshy earth sucked at their boots. To them it was nothing, a road to the capital, an easy path to conquest. But that night, as their campfires lit the valley floor, the hollow heir raised his trembling hand and whispered a command only the rivers could hear. The dams broke. Torrents of water, held back for days, surged into the valley with a roar like thunder. The ground dissolved beneath the raiders' feet, swallowing men, horses, and wagons alike. Their fires hissed out as the flood consumed them. Survivors scrambled to higher ground, only to be picked off by archers waiting on the ridges. By dawn, the valley was silent, save for the croak of frogs and the lapping of water against drowned corpses. Word of the victory spread like fire. The frail prince who could not hold a sword had destroyed an army with nothing but rivers and foresight. The peasants called it a miracle. The priests grudgingly called it divine providence. But among the nobles, fear sank deep. If this boy could command rivers, what else might he command? Was he truly their king-to-be, or was he something else? Something older, something the human crown was never meant to contain. That night, as celebrations erupted in the capital, the hollow heir did not join them. Instead, he retreated to his chamber where the voices inside his skull screamed louder than ever before. The water surged and pounded as though the sea itself was trying to burst free. In the candlelight, he gripped the arms of his chair, teeth clenched against the tide. The voices praised him, mocked him, warned him. "This is only the beginning," they whispered. For the voices inside no longer whispered of protection or prosperity. They spoke of hunger, of a longing that reached beyond soil and harvests. "The sea calls," they murmured. "The throne is but a stepping stone." "You were not made to rule men. You were made to rule waters." He tried to resist. Each night he clutched relics of his ancestors, swords and scrolls and crowns that had belonged to kings of flesh and bone. He begged the gods of stone and sky to bind him to his humanity. But when he gazed into mirrors, he no longer saw a man. His reflection rippled, distorted, as though his flesh were no more than a surface of water. His crown seemed to float upon his head, and his eyes, once pale, now glowed faintly with the shimmer of moonlit tides. The storm crowned him, but it also bound him. He realized the truth with cold clarity. Every flood he unleashed, every rain he summoned, every river he bent, it was not his power alone. It was the waters within him using him as a vessel, stretching their will through his body into the world. He was no longer master, he was becoming servant. And though his people rejoiced in their blessings, the king lay awake each night with terror swelling in his chest. For he knew what the waters desired next. And he feared that one day he would no longer have the strength to deny them. The end began not with thunder but with silence. For weeks the kingdom had basked in a strange stillness. No rains, no winds, rivers running low as though the world itself held its breath. Farmers muttered that their wells had gone dry. Sailors spoke of a sea retreating unnaturally far from its shores. The priests warned of imbalance of tides refusing the moon's command. In the palace, the hollow king grew restless. The voices inside him no longer whispered, they roared, a ceaseless tide that shook his very skull. At night he clawed at his temples, begging for quiet, yet none came. When dawn broke, servants found him staring out over the horizon, his eyes glowing with the shimmer of deep waters, his crown tilting as though it floated on unseen waves. On the day the omens could no longer be ignored, the council gathered. Nobles demanded answers. Crops were withering, trade routes collapsing, fishermen returning with empty nets. "If you are truly our king," one duke dared to shout, "then command the rains as you once did. Bring back the rivers, or admit that you are cursed and step aside." The chamber erupted into shouts, fear boiling over into open defiance. The hollow king rose slowly, his frail frame trembling as though about to collapse. But when he spoke, his voice carried the depth of oceans. "The waters do not obey me," he said, eyes burning with a cold, tidal light. "I obey them." Silence fell like a hammer, and in that silence the sound came, a low, distant rumble like mountains grinding together. They rushed to the windows. Out beyond the city walls, the horizon had vanished. In its place rose a wall of water, higher than towers, higher than hills, stretching from edge to edge of the world. The sea itself was marching inland. People screamed in the streets, bells tolled in frantic warning, horses reared in terror. The nobles turned on their king, some rushing forward to seize him, others fleeing in panic. But before a hand could touch him, the floor of the throne room shuddered. Water seeped between the stones, first in trickles, then in streams, then in torrents that burst upward like fountains. The hollow king sank back onto his throne, body convulsing, skin cracking as rivers of light spilled through the fractures. His bones, never solid, dissolved completely, leaving his body translucent, a vessel of churning tide. His voice thundered with 1,000 streams. "I am no longer king of men. I am the flood." The wave struck. The great wall of water crashed upon the capital, tearing through streets, drowning towers, shattering bridges.